I'm Claire Elizabeth Morrison, and I am 34 years old. For 7 years, I paid $4,200 every single month to keep my mother in a private memory care facility, while my father told everyone at Sunday dinner that I was selfish, ungrateful, and financially irresponsible. On March 12th, in front of my 3 siblings and their families, Dad stood up from the table, slammed his palm against the oak surface hard enough to rattle the water glasses, and screamed that all I ever did was take. Mom sat 4 feet away, hands folded in her lap, eyes on her plate. She said nothing. The total I'd paid by that Sunday came to $352,800. Not one person in that room knew except me and the billing department at Meadowbrook Care Center. Dad didn't know because Mom had begged me not to tell him 7 years earlier when the neurologist first used the word dementia, and she'd looked at me with eyes that were still clear and said she couldn't bear for him to see her that way. Not yet. Not while she could still remember his name most mornings. So I paid, and I kept paying, and I never said a word while Dad built a whole mythology about my character on a foundation of ignorance. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories. If you've ever kept a promise that cost you everything while someone else built a reputation on what they didn't know, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe. The house where this happened sits on a quarter-acre lot in Bloomington, Minnesota, a neighborhood of split-level homes built in the 1970s where everyone keeps their grass exactly 2 inches tall and the smell of charcoal starter fluid marks every summer weekend. Dad bought the house in 1982 for $89,000. By March of this year, it was worth $340,000, and he reminded us of this appreciation at least once a month, as if the housing market were a personal virtue. The dining room faces east. Morning light comes through sheer curtains Mom picked out in 1995, white with a thin gold thread that catches the sun. The table seats 8. We were 7 that Sunday. My father is Richard Morrison, 68 years old, a retired regional manager for a freight logistics company who approaches family dynamics the way he once approached shipping schedules, with hierarchies, efficiencies, and an absolute confidence that his assessments are data-driven and fair. My mother is Susan Morrison, 66 years old, a former elementary school librarian who taught me to read when I was 4 and used to slip me bookmarks with handwritten quotes about courage. She now lives in a memory care facility 22 miles away, where the hallways smell like industrial floor cleaner and vanilla plug-in air fresheners. And most days she remembers my face but not my name. My older brother is David, 37, a pharmaceutical sales representative with a mortgage, 2 kids, and a tendency to nod along with whatever Dad says because it's easier than the alternative. My younger sister is Rachel, 31, a dental hygienist married to a man who coaches high school hockey and shares every opinion Dad has ever expressed as if he thought of it first. My youngest brother is Tim, 28, still figuring himself out, still living in the apartment Dad helped him rent, still trying to earn a spot at the table where opinions are allowed to carry weight. The ranking system in our family was never written down but always understood. David's opinions mattered because he was the eldest son and made $90,000 a year. Rachel's mattered because she married well and produced 2 grandchildren by the time she turned 27. Tim's didn't matter yet, but would someday because he was a son and potential was a currency Dad understood. Mine never mattered because I'd made a series of choices Dad categorized as financial self-sabotage. I'd gone to graduate school for social work instead of business, taken a job at a nonprofit that paid $48,000 annually, rented an apartment instead of buying property, and stayed single until I was 30. Every Sunday dinner was a referendum on these choices, delivered through sighs, pointed questions, and a particular tone of voice that made concern sound like disappointment. The first slight that year happened on January 8th, in the kitchen while Rachel and I were rinsing dishes. Dad stood in the doorway with his coffee mug, the one that says World's Best Grandpa in blue letters, and asked how much I was putting into my 401k. I told him 8%. He shook his head, that slow side-to-side movement that said everything before he opened his mouth. At your age, David was already maxing his out, but then he always understood the value of planning ahead. Rachel's hands stilled in the soapy water for half a second, then continued scrubbing. Not a word. Not a glance in my direction. I dried the casserole dish and said my employer match was limited and I was doing what I could. Dad took a long sip of coffee. Doing what you can isn't the same as doing what's necessary, Claire. That's a lesson you're going to learn the hard way. The ceramic edge of the dish was still warm from the rinse water. I set it in the cupboard and closed the door with a soft click. The second slight happened on February 3rd, in the living room during halftime of a game nobody was really watching. David mentioned he'd just refinanced at 3.2% and was putting the savings into his kid's college fund. Dad clapped him on the shoulder, grinned like a proud coach, and turned to me where I sat on the couch with a book I wasn't reading. You see, Claire, that's what building generational wealth looks like. That's what it means to think beyond yourself. The book in my lap was a library copy, the plastic cover crinkling under my thumb. I nodded, said nothing. Tim cleared his throat from the armchair but didn't speak. The commercial ended. The game came back on. Dad settled back into his recliner, the leather creaking under his weight, satisfied with the point he'd made. The third slight came on February 19th over dinner, when Rachel announced she and her husband were taking the kids to Disney World in April. Mom smiled, the careful smile she wore more and more those last few months before we moved her, the one that looked right but didn't reach her eyes. Dad beamed. Now that's what I like to hear. Investing in memories, building a real family life. Then he turned those same eyes on me. When's the last time you took a real vacation, Claire? Oh, that's right. You're too busy living paycheck to paycheck because you chose a career in feelings instead of finance. David laughed. Just a short exhale through his nose, but it was enough. Rachel studied her plate. Tim stared at his water glass. Mom folded her napkin into smaller and smaller squares, her fingers trembling slightly in a way I'd started to notice more often. I cut my chicken into precise pieces and chewed slowly. The meat was dry. I swallowed and took a sip of water. I'm happy for you, Rachel. The kids will love it. Dad leaned back in his chair. Always so diplomatic. That's your problem, Claire. Too much empathy, not enough ambition. The fourth slight happened on March 5th, a Thursday, not a Sunday, which made it worse somehow. Dad called my cell at 7:18 in the evening. I was sitting in my car outside Meadowbrook after visiting Mom, the parking lot lights just starting to flicker on in the dusk. He didn't ask how I was. He led with the purpose. I need you to take Sunday off from whatever it is you do and help your mother clean out the garage. She can't lift the boxes, and I've got a golf thing. I pressed my thumb against the steering wheel, felt the textured rubber under the pad. I work Sundays, Dad. I'm covering the crisis line this month. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Of course you are. Of course you'd prioritize strangers over your own family. That's very on brand for you, Claire. A woman walked past my car toward the facility entrance, her shoulders hunched against the March wind. I watched her pull open the door and disappear inside. I can come Monday evening after 6. Forget it. I'll ask David. At least he knows what family obligation means. The call ended. I sat in the parking lot for another 11 minutes, watching the sky darken over the roofline of the building where my mother was probably already in bed, watching Jeopardy in the common room, or staring out a window at nothing. Then I drove home and made myself dinner and paid the bills that were due, including the automatic withdrawal authorization I'd set up 7 years ago for $4,200 on the 1st of every month. The inciting incident happened on March 12th. Everyone was there. David and his wife Jennifer and their 2 boys, 8 and 6, who spent most of dinner playing games on phones they were too young to own. Rachel and her husband Kyle and their daughter Emma, age 4, who sat in a booster seat and ate plain noodles because she'd recently decided everything else was poison. Tim, who'd brought nothing and no one and looked vaguely uncomfortable in his own skin the way he always did at these gatherings. Mom, who smiled at the right times and nodded when spoken to but mostly moved food around her plate in slow circles. And me. Dinner was pot roast. Mom's recipe, except Mom hadn't made it. Rachel had, following the index card in Mom's handwriting that we all pretended meant the same thing as Mom actually standing at the stove. The meat was tougher than when Mom made it. The carrots were a little too soft. No one said this. We all took seconds and complimented the meal and performed the ritual of normal. Dessert was apple pie from the bakery on Penn Avenue. Dad served it himself, cutting slices with the pie server that had belonged to his mother, silver plate worn down to brass at the handle. He was talking about property taxes, how they'd gone up again, how the city was mismanaged, how people who rented would never understand the burden of ownership. He looked directly at me when he said that last part. I took a bite of pie. The apples were mealy. I chewed and swallowed and said nothing. Then David mentioned something about the school levy and how he'd voted against it because his property taxes were already obscene, and Dad was off, expansive and confident, talking about fiscal responsibility and how this generation didn't understand the value of $1. Rachel agreed. Kyle agreed with Rachel. Tim stared at his pie. Mom folded and refolded her napkin. I made the mistake of speaking. The levy funds special education services. A lot of kids depend on those programs. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Dad set down his fork. The tines clicked against the plate. Of course you'd say that. Of course you'd defend more government spending. You've never paid property taxes in your life, Claire. You've never owned anything. You rent a one-bedroom apartment and drive a 12-year-old Civic and live like you're still in college. So forgive me if I don't take economic advice from someone who's never built anything of value. My hands rested in my lap, fingers laced together. I could feel my pulse in my thumbs. I was just saying the programs serve vulnerable kids. It wasn't economic advice. Everything's vulnerable with you. Everything's feelings. You work a job that pays nothing, you save nothing, you invest nothing, and then you have the nerve to sit at my table and lecture me about how I should vote to raise my own taxes. David looked at his plate. Rachel looked at Kyle. Tim opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. Mom's hands were shaking badly enough that her water glass trembled when she reached for it. I kept my voice level. I wasn't lecturing you, Dad. I was offering a perspective. A perspective, he laughed. One sharp bark. You want to talk about perspective? Let's talk about how you show up here every week with nothing. No husband, no kids, no house, no career worth mentioning. You take and take and take. My time, your mother's energy, the food we serve, the family we've built. And you contribute what, exactly? Opinions about how other people should spend their money? He stood up, all 6'2" of him, face red, finger pointing. All you ever do is take, Claire. You're 34 years old and you've got nothing to show for your life except a degree in helping people feel better about their problems and a self-righteous attitude about everyone else's choices. The room was silent. Even the kids had stopped fidgeting. Mom sat frozen, eyes down, napkin twisted between her hands. I waited for her to speak. Waited for her to say one word. Anything. The furnace kicked on somewhere in the basement. Air wheezed through the vents. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line and she said nothing at all. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair in. The felt pads on the bottom made no sound against the hardwood. Thank you for dinner. I walked to the front door, picked up my coat from the rack, and left. The door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam. My car was parked on the street in front of the house. The interior was cold. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel and breathed in and out for 90 seconds while I made a decision that had been forming for 7 years. I drove home, made tea, chamomile, the kind Mom used to make on school nights when I was anxious about a test. Sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened the folder I kept both digitally and in hard copy in a locked file box under my bed. Inside were 84 months of invoices from Meadowbrook Care Center. Every single one paid in full, on time, by automatic bank transfer from my checking account. Total? $352,800. Also in the folder, the intake paperwork from September 2016 when we'd first moved Mom into the facility. The neurologist's assessment from Dr. Patricia Hemmings dated August 30th, 2016, listing mild cognitive impairment progressing to early-stage Alzheimer's. The signed form from Mom, still legally competent at the time, requesting that the billing and medical information be shared only with me and that her residence at the facility remain private from the rest of the family at her request. Her handwriting on that form was shaky but legible. I'd watched her sign it while sitting in the administrator's office that smelled like vanilla and sadness and industrial carpet cleaner. She'd looked at me afterward and said, "Just until I'm ready. Just until I can explain it in a way he'll understand." She'd never been ready. And month after month I'd paid, because that's what she'd asked me to do, and because she was my mother, and because some promises matter more than money. I opened a new document, typed out a timeline, September 2016 to March 2024, 84 months, $4,200 per month. List of every service included: private room, 24-hour nursing care, medication management, memory care programming, 3 meals daily, laundry service, activities coordination. I attached scanned copies of every invoice, every bank statement showing the withdrawal, every annual summary from the facility, the neurologist's reports tracking Mom's decline, the signed consent forms. Then I called the one person who'd ever listened to me without judgment. My college roommate Anne lived in Madison now, worked as a paralegal, had a way of cutting through emotional fog to find the structural bones of a problem. She answered on the second ring. "Claire, what's wrong?" I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 5 seconds. "Do you want vindication or do you just want out?" "Both." "Then we do this right. You've got documentation. You've got a paper trail. You've got a witness, someone at the facility who can confirm the arrangement. What you do is simple. You write one letter. You lay out the facts. You send copies to every single person who was at that table, and then you let them sit with it. He'll just get angrier. Let him. You've got the truth, Claire. You've been carrying it alone for 7 years. Time to let everyone else hold some of the weight." I stayed on the phone with her for another 40 minutes while we outlined exactly what the letter would say. The next morning, Monday, March 13th, I called Meadowbrook and made an appointment with the billing director, a woman named Linda Kowalski, who'd processed every one of my payments and who remembered my name every time I visited. I met her on Tuesday at 3 p.m. in her office on the second floor of the administrative wing. The room smelled like coffee and paper and that specific kind of floral air freshener used in medical buildings everywhere. "I need a letter," I told her, confirming the dates, the amounts, the payment history, and the arrangement we set up per my mother's request. Linda looked at me over her reading glasses. She was maybe 55, with gray hair cut short and efficient, and the kind of steady eye contact that said she'd seen every kind of family drama this job could offer. "Is everything all right?" "It will be." She printed the letter on official letterhead, signed it, notarized it with the stamp she kept in her desk drawer. The paper was still warm from the printer when she handed it to me. "Your mother's lucky to have you." I folded the letter into thirds and slid it into my bag. "Thank you." That evening I drafted the message, short, factual, undeniable. I included the total amount, the timeline, the reason for the secrecy, and Mom's written request. I attached the letter from Linda Kowalski, 3 sample invoices, and a single-page summary of Mom's medical timeline from the neurologist. I didn't editorialize, didn't plead my case, didn't ask for an apology, just presented the facts in 11-point Times New Roman, single-spaced, on 2 pages. At the top I wrote, "This is the financial contribution you said didn't exist. This is what you called taking." I sent it at 7:04 p.m. on March 15th to David, Rachel, and Tim via email. I printed 3 hard copies, put them in envelopes, and mailed them certified mail to the same addresses. Then I made myself dinner, watched half of a movie I'd already seen, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The first response came from Tim at 9:22 p.m. that same night. A text message. 5 words. "Holy shit, I'm so sorry." The second came from Rachel the next morning at 6:47 a.m. Also a text. "Why didn't you tell us?" I didn't reply to either. The third response came from David at 11:03 a.m. on March 16th. A phone call I didn't answer, followed by a voicemail that lasted 2 minutes and 14 seconds. His voice was tight, confused, defensive. "Claire, I don't understand why you kept this secret. This is something we all should have known. We could have helped. We could have split the cost. This doesn't make sense. Call me back." I didn't call back. The fourth response came from Dad at 4:35 p.m. on March 16th. A voicemail, not a call I had the chance to decline because I was in a session with a client and my phone was on silent. His voice was different, smaller. "Claire, your brother forwarded me some kind of letter. I need you to call me. We need to talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding." I saved the voicemail. Didn't return the call. By March 18th, 3 days after I sent the letter, the silence from my family was louder than any of the responses. I went to work, saw my clients, covered the crisis line, lived my life. On March 21st, I got a call from Meadowbrook, Linda Kowalski again. Claire, your father was here today. He wanted to see the records. I told him I could only release information to the authorized contacts on file, which is you and your mother isn't able to provide consent anymore. He wasn't happy, but he left. I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me. He also asked how to take over the payments. I told him he'd need to discuss that with you since you're the account holder. Something cold settled in my chest. What did he say? He said he'd handle it. Then he left. I thanked her and hung up. Sat very still for a long time. Then I called Anne. He's going to try to take control of the narrative, she said. He's going to make this about him being shut out, not about him being wrong. You need to get ahead of it. How? You go public. Not social media public, family public. You call a meeting, you invite everyone. You bring the documents, you let them ask questions in real time, in front of each other, where nobody can rewrite the story later. He'll lose his mind, probably, but he'll lose it in front of witnesses. And Claire, you've been losing yourself quietly for years. Maybe it's time to let him be the loud one for once. I considered this, turned it over, tested the weight of it. Okay. I sent an email on March 22nd to David, Rachel, and Tim. Subject line, family meeting, message, Sunday, March 26th, 1 p.m. at my apartment. We're going to talk about Mom, the facility, the finances, and the arrangement we've had in place for 7 years. You're welcome to bring your spouses. Dad is also invited, but this meeting is happening whether he attends or not. Rachel replied within an hour. I'll be there. Tim replied 20 minutes later. Me too. David took until 9 p.m. I think this is a conversation we should have at Mom and Dad's house, not your apartment. I replied immediately. My apartment, my documents, my terms, you're welcome to attend or not. He didn't respond again, but on Sunday, March 26th, at 12:58 p.m., all 3 of my siblings arrived. Rachel came alone, Tim came alone, David brought Jennifer, no one brought Dad. They sat in my living room, on the couch and the 2 armchairs I'd bought secondhand and reupholstered myself, drinking water from the glasses I'd set out, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the small space that Dad had so often mocked. My apartment is 750 square feet, 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, a kitchen barely big enough for 1 person. The light comes in from the west in the afternoons and makes everything look softer than it is. I'd set up a folding chair for myself and placed a cardboard file box on the coffee table between us. I didn't offer pleasantries, didn't make small talk, just opened the box. This is every invoice from Meadowbrook Care Center from September 2016 to March 2024. 84 months, $4,200 per month. Total paid, $352,800. This is the notarized letter from the billing director confirming the payment history and the arrangement. This is the intake paperwork from September 2016 with Mom's signature requesting privacy. This is the neurologist's assessment from August 2016. This is the legal document Mom signed while she was still competent, designating me as her healthcare proxy and financial proxy for all matters related to her care at Meadowbrook. I laid each document on the coffee table as I named it. They stared. Rachel spoke first, voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't she want Dad to know? Because she was scared. Because the diagnosis terrified her and she needed time to process it. And she knew Dad would take over, would make decisions, would turn her illness into something he managed instead of something she experienced. She asked me to give her time. I gave her what she asked for. Tim leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But 7 years, Claire. 7 years and you never said anything. She never felt ready. And then the disease progressed to the point where she couldn't make that decision anymore. So I kept my promise. David's jaw worked like he was chewing words he didn't want to swallow. You should have told us. We could have helped pay. Could you have kept the secret? If Dad asked directly, could you have looked him in the eye and said nothing? Silence. Long and telling. Jennifer, who almost never spoke up in family matters, cleared her throat. How did you afford it? On your salary? I didn't afford it comfortably. I drove the same car for 12 years. I rented instead of buying. I didn't take vacations. I didn't go out. I didn't date much because dinner and a movie felt like an expense I couldn't justify. I lived small so Mom could be safe. Rachel's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. And Dad called you selfish. Every week, in one way or another, for 7 years. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Tim finally said what they were all thinking. Does he know now? Have you told him directly? I sent him the same documentation I sent you. He hasn't contacted me except to leave a voicemail saying there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. David's voice was flat. He looked at the stack of invoices, the notarized letter, the medical reports. How does he misunderstand this? Because acknowledging it means acknowledging he was wrong. And Dad doesn't do wrong. He does misunderstood. Rachel picked up one of the invoices, stared at it like it was written in a language she was only just learning to read. What happens now? Now you decide what you believe. What you do with that belief is up to you. But I'm done defending myself for something I never did wrong. They left 40 minutes later. After asking questions I answered with facts, dates, numbers. No one cried, no one yelled. They just absorbed and processed and eventually stood up to leave, carrying the weight of the truth with them out the door. David paused in the doorway. I'm sorry. For not questioning it. For not defending you. For laughing that one time at dinner. I'm sorry. I nodded. Didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. I believe you. He left. The apartment was quiet. I put the documents back in the box and slid it under my bed and made myself tea. The reckoning with Dad happened in a way I didn't orchestrate and couldn't have predicted. On April 2nd, 2 weeks after the meeting at my apartment, Rachel and David went to Sunday dinner. Tim told me later he'd skipped it. They sat at the same table, ate the same pot roast, performed the same rituals. But when Dad started in on his usual commentary about fiscal responsibility and property values and the failures of my generation, David interrupted him. Dad, we need to talk about Claire. The room went still. What about her? About the things you've said. About what she's contributed. About what you don't know. Rachel told me later that Dad's face went through 3 distinct expressions: confusion, irritation, then something like dread. I don't know what she told you, but she didn't tell us anything for 7 years. She kept a promise to Mom. While you called her selfish, she was paying $4,200 a month to keep Mom safe in a memory care facility. $352,800, Dad, out of a $48,000 salary. The color drained from Dad's face in a way Rachel described as startling, like watching paint run in reverse. That's not. Your mother isn't in a facility. She's here. When's the last time you saw her, Dad? The silence answered for him. David placed a folder on the table, the same documents I'd given them. Invoices, medical reports, the notarized letter, Mom's signature on the intake form. She's been at Meadowbrook for 7 years. Claire's been paying for it alone, and you've been calling her a taker. Dad picked up the top invoice with shaking hands. Read it. Set it down. Picked up the next one. His mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. Rachel's voice was quiet but clear. You owe her an apology, a real one. And you owe her about $250,000 if we're splitting this fairly among the 4 of us for the last 7 years. Dad looked at Mom's signature on the intake paperwork, stared at it for a long time. She didn't tell me. Because she asked Claire not to, and Claire kept her promise. He didn't come to dinner the following Sunday, or the one after that. Rachel called me on April 18th to tell me he'd gone to Meadowbrook, sat with Mom for 3 hours, came home and locked himself in his office. When she called to check on him, he sounded like he'd been crying. Tim called on April 22nd. He wants to talk to you. He's not ready yet, but he wants me to tell you he's trying to find the words. He can take his time. Claire, he's a mess. I've never seen him like this. Good. Maybe he needed to be. The apology came on May 1st. Not in person, but in a letter delivered to my mailbox in an envelope with my name written in Dad's blocky handwriting. 3 pages, front and back. I read it standing in my kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. He didn't make excuses, didn't justify, didn't minimize. He laid out every specific thing he'd said, every accusation, every dismissive comment. He acknowledged the cruelty. He named the ignorance. He said he'd set up a payment plan with Meadowbrook to reimburse me in full, plus interest, and that he'd ask David and Rachel to contribute their share. He said he visited Mom 3 times a week now and was learning how to sit with someone who didn't always remember him. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him and that he didn't deserve to ask. He signed it Dad, and then below that, smaller, Richard. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Didn't respond for 2 weeks. On May 15th, I replied with a postcard. 1 sentence. Thank you for finally seeing what was there. The money started arriving on June 1st. Direct deposit, $2,500 a month from an account in Dad's name. The payment schedule he'd attached to a follow-up email showed 141 months to repay the full amount plus 4% interest. He'd be 80 when the last payment cleared. I didn't argue with the timeline. David sent a check for $15,000 in July with a note that said he'd send more when he could. Rachel sent $10,000 in August and a text saying she was setting up monthly payments. Tim, who had the least, sent $500 and an apology that he couldn't do more. I deposited all of it into a savings account I labeled Mom's Care and didn't touch. Sunday dinners continued, but I didn't attend. Rachel started hosting instead, at her house, and invited me specifically, without Dad. I went to those. They were quieter, kinder. The pot roast was still too dry, but no one performed competence anymore. We just ate and talked and sometimes sat in silence that didn't feel like judgment. Dad and I spoke again on September 10th, 6 months after the blow-up. He called and asked if he could buy me coffee. We met at a diner on Lyndale Avenue, the kind with red vinyl booths and laminated menus. He looked older, thinner. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his mug. I don't know how to make this right. You can't. You can just do better going forward. Is that enough? I don't know yet. We sat there for an hour. He asked about work. I told him. He asked if I'd gone to see Mom recently. I had. He asked if she ever had good days. Sometimes, I said. Fewer now. He cried quietly into a paper napkin, and I didn't look away. When we left, he hugged me. I let him. I still visit Mom every Sunday. She doesn't know my name anymore, but she smiles when I walk in, and sometimes she holds my hand. The facility is bright and clean, and the staff know her favorite songs. Dad visits on Wednesdays and Fridays. We coordinate so we don't overlap. Not out of anger anymore, just because some things are easier alone. I live in the same apartment, drive the same car, work the same job. My savings account is growing for the first time in 7 years. Last month I went on a vacation, a real one, to the North Shore, stayed in a cabin near Lutzen, watched the lake break against the rocks, and didn't think about anyone's opinion of the choice. David and I have coffee once a month now. Rachel and I text more. Tim came over last week and I taught him how to make Mom's pot roast, the real version, and he wrote down every step. We didn't talk about Dad. We didn't need to. The family isn't healed. I'm not sure it ever will be. But the truth is out, and the weight is shared, and I am no longer the only one carrying what no one else could see. I lost the fantasy that my father was infallible. I lost the hope that my mother would recover enough to explain herself. I lost 7 years of financial stability and the belief that sacrifice is always recognized. I gained a boundary I will never apologize for. I gained the knowledge that I can keep a promise even when it costs me everything. I gained a voice that doesn't need volume to be heard. Some people will call you selfish for protecting what matters. Let them. You'll know the truth. And eventually, if you stand still enough, the truth will find its way to the light. I am not what my father called me. I never was. And I don't need him to say it anymore to know it's true. Thank you for staying until the end. Your presence here matters. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.